bosse en bome, tussen grense wag ons almal vermore. Maar op 18 was ons almal verlore. Hoe kan ons verstaan? En wie vlieg nou ons lewe? Want net God alleen weet waar ons bewe. Want op 18 wou ons almal net lewe. Net een slag toe was jou lewe voorbij.
Hi guys, this is Vera with Slot Machine, and this is our second episode. And today we have a very special guest from South Africa, Dan Roodt. Dan, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I was born not far from Johannesburg, and I grew up mostly in the city and went to school here, high school, and then I studied at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is an English language university, despite the Afrikaans name, a very left-wing institution, I might add as well. So, I went through the whole kind of cultural Marxist, or not even that cultural experience. At the time, it was more almost Marxist-Leninist. And afterwards, I lived in France for a few years, for about 7 years or so. I've also worked in the financial industry, but since about 2000, I've been active on the fringes of politics and cultural politics in South Africa, and I've also been campaigning for, the rights of minorities and also for Afrikaans language rights. There's recently, they banned Afrikaans at a number of universities in South Africa, which just shows how completely inconsistent and unfair the whole system is here. I mean, they're in flagrant disregard of the Constitution, but it doesn't seem to bother anyone. There's just a system of double standards here that's almost unprecedented in the world. Yes, and I write quite a lot of stuff on the internet, and I'm fairly active on social media such as Facebook and Twitter. And we've got a website called praag.org, praag.org, where we publish quite a few news articles and columns and comments and so on.
And you've also been a speaker at American Renaissance as well, right?
Yes, I've been invited there a number of times. The last time was last year near Nashville, Tennessee. I think these days they hold it there every year because there were a couple of conferences that were disrupted by leftists or...
I see you got to meet Antifa.
Yes.
Yeah, aren't they
so
lovely
at least
people?
one of them that I'd seen, it was sort of almost held in secret, which was quite interesting. We were all kind of hushed up in a hotel, and it was just recorded, but there weren't any public attendees at the time. That was in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I think many thanks to the American Renaissance Conference, I've seen quite a bit of the U.S., and sort of cities that I gather not all Americans would go to.
Yeah. Did you enjoy America?
Oh, yes. Of course, to some extent, South Africa has also been very Americanized. We've also got McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken.
I heard you guys got Burger King now.
Yes, and Burger King and Pizza Hut have also arrived. So it's almost, a friend of mine who now lives in Australia, he once told me that he doesn't need to go to the USA because he's already got it in his living room, So there's that element, yeah, I mean, and when people from Europe come here, they say, "Oh, but this looks so much like America."
I know.
Which is true because it's the same sort of lifestyle of shopping centers and urban sprawl.
Especially in Santon.
Sorry?
Especially in Santon, like the mall there and everything is very Americanized.
Exactly. But I mean, South Africa is supposed to be one of the countries, if not the country with the most shopping malls in the world. I don't know about the US, but we've got more shopping malls than any other country, including Germany and Australia.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, there are over 2,000 big shopping malls in South Africa.
Wow.
So, and they built a huge one recently in Midrand as well, which is called the Mall of Africa. And that's also very big. It's about the same size as the one in Santon. Yeah, so, and to me, it doesn't seem very sustainable, but they seem to keep on adding shopping malls all the time. I mean, there's a road between here and Pretoria called the N14, and I saw on the left-hand side of the road there, they were starting some sort of construction, and then about 6 months later, there was a new shopping mall and another big one just right next to the highway. So yeah, it's happening all the time, and it's driven by the banks who lend money to the developers, but it's also driven, I think, to some extent by the fact that South Africa has become a kind of shopping destination for the whole of Africa, and you've got a lot of people from all over Africa coming here to shop, basically. I mean, the ones who haven't got a lot of money and who buy really down market goods, they shop in the center of Johannesburg, in the downtown area, which has become quite run down and Africanized. You know, it looks like part of Africa more than anything else. Whereas the suburbs look more like America, I would say. and there's a huge, I once read an article about it, and there's a huge influx of people who come from other African countries, and they buy goods in bulk, which they then take back with them. And they buy it from other Africans or Chinese or Pakistani dealers, and they take it back with them to Africa and resell it there. And if you go to downtown Johannesburg, you know, it's just crawling with people and very crowded. And you've got these, lots of little shops.
What area is the Mandela Center? I know I've been there.
Oh, yes.
I've been there before.
Well, there's part of the Santon shopping mall used to be a thing called Santon Square, I think, but they renamed that one a few years ago to Nelson Mandela Square. And there's
that statue, giant statue.
Exactly. There's a sort of quasi-Soviet, social realist statue. Huge thing in bronze standing there. Just surrounded by restaurants and upmarket shops. It's quite ironic, I think, because he was essentially most of his life a communist as well.
Yes.
So to have a communist honored or celebrated with social realist sculpture in the middle of this gigantic shopping mall. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't
really add up. Yeah,
exactly.
No. What do you think about what's happening right now in Rhodesia with the whole Mugabe thing? Do you think
I think it's just more of the same. I mean, obviously there was a bit of a power struggle within the ruling party.
Uh-huh.
If you look at Southern Africa, and I think the West is also to blame for this because, both the US and I think the UK as well, and of course the Scandinavian countries, Socialist France, Socialist Party in France, they all pushed very hard for these Marxist movements that they called liberation movements, but that were essentially terrorist movements.
Yeah.
I mean, they practiced urban terrorism. The ANC placed 200 bombs in shopping malls and post offices and on the street and so on in South Africa, exactly like some of the so-called Islamic terrorists do today in Europe. And they pushed for these groups to actually take over the entire Southern Africa, which they have. And not in one of those countries have we had a change of government ever from one party to the next. I mean, in Angola, they've had the Marxist MPLA, but which is also corrupt in the sense that the daughter of the ruling dictator, she owns about half the country, including its oil wealth. But I think Dos Santos is also now, he's on his way out now, but his daughter is sort of taking over from him.
It seems like a pattern almost with the women.
Exactly. They found exactly. You're right there. I also thought to myself that what's happening now is that out of these Marxist terrorist movements have now arisen almost dynasties of certain powerful families. And with Mugabe, you had the same kind of thing in the ex-Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. And he tried to get his wife to take over from him. And in South Africa,
Winnie.
Zuma, Winnie was there involved, Nelson Mandela's wife. Yes.
Yeah.
But currently, at this very moment, they've got a conference, the ANC's annual. I think it's a quadri-annual conference where they're going to choose a new leader. And Zuma is pushing for his ex-wife.
Doesn't he have like 11 wives or something?
Well, he's got about 5 or 6, but he divorced this one. But I mean, rumor has it that they're not really divorced, but officially they are divorced. And there's a strong possibility that she will become the new leader after him. So he's had 2 terms as president. And then she will take over from him. But essentially, the whole clan from his part of Natal, KwaZulu-Natal, they control the ANC to a large extent at the moment. And and the ex-wife might take over. And that will be the start of a Zuma dynasty in South Africa.
Is there a difference between the ANC and the EFF, or do you think that they're in cahoots with one another?
Well, some people claim that they are in cahoots, but there does seem to be a personality clash between Zuma and the ex-head of the ANC youth movement, Julius Malema, who then walked out to found his own party, this EFF. But ideologically, there's very little difference between them because they're essentially saying the same thing, and they're pushing for a radical redistribution of wealth in South Africa, even though to a large extent it has already taken place. And they also want to, they want to follow the Zimbabwe policy towards the white farmers in South Africa. They just want to confiscate their land and just push them off their farms, violently. I mean, and the EFF is calling for that all of the time. And the ex-Mrs. Zuma, she still calls herself Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Her maiden name, surname is, or last name, as you say in the US, is Dlamini, but she still uses the double barrel name, using her husband's last name as well, Dlamini Zuma. And she has made a big point lately over the last few months of saying that they should take the farmers' land and there should be expropriation without compensation, it's called. So, yeah, there's not much of a policy difference between the two at all.
They're both Afrocentric Marxists.
Yes. And ironically, the Liberal Party in South Africa, the DA, or the Democratic Alliance, they are now in coalition with the EFF in several metropolitan areas. And, the ANC created these huge so-called metros or metropolitan municipalities that are almost like countries or states, where millions of people live and spread over really large areas as well. And the main reason why they did that is because they wanted to concentrate the local taxes in these large entities so that they could be the better to loot them. And local government in South Africa has been more corrupt than national government, because at the local government level, they just openly, steal from the taxpayer and pay themselves very large salaries, and the people in the government trade with the municipality, and they create contracts and deals and so on. So local government is really bad in South Africa, and it's there where you can see the big difference between what it was like under the white rule before and what it's like now. I mean, it's like night and day, or day and night. Before the municipalities were very well run and financially conservative and not corrupt, and the services were good. I mean, we had water and electricity that were cheap, but whereas now, a lot of the time, the power cuts and blackouts have diminished a little, but the water has now become a major issue, and every now and again we're without water, and there's a huge crisis in a lot of municipalities around water. I know in the center of South Africa there's a city called Bloemfontein.
That's where my granny's from.
Yes, and they've been without water now for about 10 days, as far as I know.
I was reading that they haven't changed the pipes.
People have to kind of get water out of their swimming pools or buy it from the shops and so on. Yeah, drinking water you buy from the shop, and if you want to bath, wash yourself, you've got to get it out of your own swimming pool. If you haven't got a swimming pool, then you've got a problem.
That's unbelievable. So I've been hearing about a project called the Good Hope Project.
Yes.
What is your opinion on that? Do you think it's feasible, or do you think it's not realistic?
Are you talking now about the independence of the Cape, or?
Yes. Yeah.
I think it could be feasible, because the demographics down there in the Western Cape is different to the rest of the country. You've got a majority of colored people there, and quite a large percentage of whites as well. But on the other hand, the percentage of blacks or Xhosa speakers down there is also growing. But if there were a strong movement for the independence of the Western Cape, I think something like that could could succeed, because the Western Cape's economy is also different to the one in the rest of the country. Up here where we live, it's mostly dependent on mining and industry, whereas down there they've got wine and fruit growing and tourism. So it's not really dependent much on the rest of South Africa. They've got a lot of foreigners and Europeans who visit the place and spend their money there. And they've also got people working in the film industry and in high tech and so on. Those are sort of up and coming industries there. So it could work, yes. But the question is whether it'll ever become a mainstream political issue, in that the Liberal Party, the DA, is quite entrenched down there, and they certainly are opposed to any form of partition for South Africa. So, and the media, of course, the mainstream media, they don't support that idea. So I think we need some sort of revolution in public opinion for it to happen. But as things get worse, of course, people will be looking for alternatives. But there are other areas in South Africa where some form of self-determination could also work. Large parts of the old Transvaal and Free State are also
like Orania.
Yes, something like that. That's in the Northern Cape, but people also have a project like that just east of Pretoria called Kleinfontein.
Okay.
And large parts of Pretoria and the East Rand are also demographically suitable for, to become independent from the rest of South Africa. I would say they just need some form of access to the coast. But you could draw a map giving them access to the coast, because what's happening is that most of the black population is becoming concentrated in 2 or 3 large cities, and the rest of the country is virtually empty. I mean, you can drive for miles and miles and not see anyone. The rest of the country is virtually empty.
What 3 areas are the blacks becoming more concentrated in?
Well, especially around Johannesburg and Pretoria to a lesser extent, but I mean Johannesburg is drawing, and Durban and Cape Town too. But I would say Durban and Johannesburg are probably the 2 main poles attracting black people from all over South Africa, but also from the rest of Africa. I mean, there are parts of Johannesburg which they call Little Lagos or Little Ethiopia or Little Congo.
I always thought that the blacks in South Africa didn't get along with the other Africans.
They don't, but you've got these kind of ghettos forming where foreign Africans would live among themselves and speak their own languages.
So they don't assimilate into actual...
No.
Okay.
No, they don't. And of course, the local blacks actually physically attack them quite often, or mistreat them, or just steal from them in broad daylight. I mean, they would rob them of their goods as they come from the supermarket. And the police would just turn a blind eye. And those sorts of things are never written about by the mainstream journalists, although there was an article in the New York Times, quite a long article a few years ago, about a Zimbabwean being killed in broad daylight, not too far from where I live, in a place called Diepsloot. And it was even recorded on video.
I saw that, actually.
Yes. So, but those sorts of articles are quite rare, where you would get somebody from a mainstream journalist writing about these xenophobic attacks, as they call them in South Africa. For the most part, we all hear, we just hear about the harmony and the democracy and how people are getting along so well, now that we're living under African rule. Whereas, of course, in reality, it's quite different. I think in the past in South Africa, there was a lot more tolerance between the various ethnic groups than now. There's a lot more hostility and acrimony now than ever before.
Yeah, I also think that has to do with, the older generations that did live under apartheid and have watched the country crumble. And, the younger generation being taught to blame the white man for everything.
Yes, that's what they've been taught in the schools and what they're reading in the media as well. And we've got terribly liberal and even Marxist media in South Africa. I mean, there's a business newspaper here called the Business Day, and I always say that it must be the only Marxist business newspaper in the world, because in the one section of the paper you can read about the stock market and the company results, but in the main opinion section they've got all these people writing on how everything should be nationalized and how whites should be punished and put through re-education programs and so on. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Wall Street Journal is probably also not exactly a conservative paper, but I mean, it's not. I mean, the Business Day is several miles to the left of the Wall Street Journal. That's for sure. And the rest of the media are even worse. I mean, it's all of this anti-white, politically correct propaganda that we read all the time. And I mean, until recently, there was even a lot of sympathy for Robert Mugabe.
I know.
But, given the vagaries of his rule in Zimbabwe and how that country has gone down the drain.
Vile man.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, he's not exactly seen as a very good person in South Africa anymore. But now, I mean, with this change of government, I think I didn't quite answer your question on whether it's going to be a big improvement in Zimbabwe. I think it's kind of shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic, because I mean, this character that's taking over from him is actually one of his chief henchmen, and who helped him in the past to stay in power, and he's going to apply the same methods and the same policies. Even now, though he's now promised that he would compensate the white farmers for having taken their land. But first of all, you don't see how he's going to be able to do that, because his government is bankrupt and they don't have the money for that. So that immediately leads to the deduction that he's going to ask some Western country for the money to give some form of token compensation to all these farmers whose land has been confiscated. And you also get the impression that this whole move in Zimbabwe was done not so much because the ruling clique was tired of Mugabe, but because they want a new round of Western aid money to be channeled towards Zimbabwe. I think that's what we're going to see, over the next few months and years, is that Zimbabwe will apply for aid to various Western countries and international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and so on. And this inflow of cash will then again be appropriated by ruling clique over there. So, but for the ordinary African in Zimbabwe, it's not going to make a difference at all. And of course,
right, and they're starving to death there.
Yes, they are starving, and the whole country is being kept afloat by about 3 or 4 million of them who are illegal aliens who have come to South Africa, and they work here, and they repatriate part of their income, and that's actually the main source of income and of foreign exchange for Zimbabwe.
And does Zimbabwe actually use yen now?
Well, they're supposed to use the US dollar as a currency after the collapse of the Zimbabwean dollar some years ago when they had hyperinflation. But apparently there are not enough US dollars to go around. So in practice, there's a perpetual cash shortage in the country. Some of them also use rands from South Africa. I think it's also accepted there as a currency, but officially it's now the US dollar. But then the government has also tried in all sorts of ways to introduce a new currency by which they call bond notes that are supposedly like US dollars, but dollars printed by the Zimbabwean government and then backed by a US dollar loan, which they got from some foreign bank. But people don't like those, those pseudo dollar notes and try to avoid them. And in practice, it's completely insane because apparently in any shop in Zimbabwe, there are 3 different prices depending on which currency you're going to use. If you're paying in greenbacks, then you get one price. If you're paying in bond notes, you've got to add about 20 or 30% to it. And if you're paying by credit card, you also have to pay more, because the problem is apparently even if you do get money from somebody else via a credit card or a bank wire transfer, you can't get the money out of your bank account because there are restrictions on the amount of money people are allowed to withdraw imposed by the government. So, money that's in the bank comes at a discount to cash. So, and there are people apparently who, there are all sorts of intermediaries and scammers and so on who then pay. They take a huge commission if they're going to give you cash up front. You pay them into their account, and then they give you cash minus 20 or 30%.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's
they really know how to make things confusing.
They do.
But not only that, and they're really smart at scamming.
Oh yes. Of course the Nigerians have a reputation for the most devious scam artists of all, and there are lots of them now in South Africa too, and they are extremely wealthy too, it seems, because they've moved into some of the wealthier areas, and they don't seem to have a shortage of money at all. They've taken over the drug trade as well. We didn't have a drug problem before because our police was quite efficient in suppressing it. And I spoke to an ex-policeman a short while ago, and he told me that we had almost an innocent kind of a drug trade. There were a few mixed race people selling marijuana, and everybody knew who they were. Yes, dacha as we call it. And it wasn't violent at all. And it was completely, the police knew about it and it was sort of under control. And then when the Nigerian, after 1994, we got the hard drugs and the Nigerians and the killings and the turf wars between gangs. So, yeah, I mean, that aspect, I mean, from a crime point of view, South Africa has just become a kind of a, it's almost like a criminal state. I mean, with the growth of organized crime in this country, and especially around drugs, and before, I mean, our teenagers didn't really know what drugs were, whereas now, around every school there are one or two pushers, wanting to get young people hooked on drugs. So, yes, I think that has been one of the. Also, it's not written about at all. Is the deterioration as far as the drug problem is concerned, and we have a huge drug problem now, and also especially amongst the black youth.
Yeah, I actually watched a documentary about that, about the Cape Coloreds.
Yes,
and they're addicted to what do you guys call Twitch or Tick? I'm sorry, Tick.
Yes,
which we call crystal meth. We call it crystal meth here.
Yes. And there's also a thing, I think they call it nyope or something like that, which is smoked by blacks. Yeah, it's a huge problem. So that's why even among black people, probably the majority now feel that things were better under apartheid than now.
Yes.
I mean, there was even an official survey done a few months ago where the majority of the country's population of all races felt that things were better under apartheid than now. But of course, the mainstream media, they just sort of, it got mentioned somewhere on page 5 or something like that, and immediately scoffed at. How ridiculous is that?
Well, apartheid here has an unfair reputation in the United States. They don't understand why it was necessary.
Yes, and ironically, Europe is now looking at a form of apartheid. More and more, I look at the pronouncements of the European Union and some of the leaders from European countries, and they are saying exactly the same things as our leaders said in the 1960s. It's like deja vu. Seeing these people saying, oh, well, we have to develop the African countries in order to stop them from migrating towards us.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been essentially the history of South Africa during the 20th century, is that, we saw this huge flow of people towards the developed parts of the country. And we thought that by giving people their own independent countries and, providing them with development aid and, governments and handouts and so on, we could actually... Hospitals and clinics and schools and so on. We could stem the flow.
Yeah.
But it didn't succeed either because the system was not applied ruthlessly enough. Because even though we had such a reputation for being, a country where there were human rights abuses and so on, in actual fact, I think we were far... we weren't really applying the rules at all, and people were far too lenient on those rules.
My dad says,
and as a result, and as a result, we didn't manage to reverse the flows of people towards the so-called white areas, and that's why we ended up now being dominated by people from Zululand or Transkei or places like that. The notion that where I live at the moment, this used to be a Boer republic in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're essentially being ruled by a Zulu dynasty from 600 kilometers away. And we fought a war against the Zulus in the 1830s.
Oh,
which
yeah.
we won.
Blood River,
So
right?
why did we fight that war if we are now being ruled by the Zulus? It doesn't make sense at all.
No. I mean, my dad said, growing up during apartheid, it was not just strict with the blacks, it was strict as a nation. It was to keep degeneracy out of the country. Like, some music wasn't allowed. It was strict for a reason, to keep, South Africa a moral country, for one. And second of all, I mean, you guys were at war with Angola for 24 years?
Yes, exactly. And we were in the lines of sight of, in the sights of of the whole communist world, the ex-Soviet Union, East Germany, Cuba, and places like that. They wanted to overthrow our government, and they were quite open about that. So yes, we were involved in this war in Southern Africa. I mean, we had all these dominoes falling around us. Other countries like the Portuguese colonies, and then Rhodesia and so on, that all became Marxist states, and quite openly Marxist. I mean, they had hammers and sickles in their flags, and they were openly communist. So we were fighting this war with very little aid from the Western countries. I mean, in fact, we had an arms boycott from the Western countries while that was going on. So in a sense, the Western countries were actually helping the ex-Soviet Union to overthrow us. And regarding South Africa has always been quite a religious country.
Right.
We're not a secular country like France or Russia or someplace like that. And I think that has always been a good thing, because Christianity has to some extent displaced, or at least held at bay, the more primitive beliefs of Africans. Africans come from a culture of magic, which also
witch doctors,
magic, witchcraft, and witch doctors, and so on, and ritual killings.
Yes.
Every year in South Africa, there are at least 400 ritual killings. And there's trafficking of human body parts and that sort of thing. It's really grisly stuff. And with the one apartheid law, one of the worst apartheid laws, you could say it's one of the most racist laws as well, was passed in 1957, called the Suppression of Witchcraft Act, which actually regulated witchcraft in South Africa, and it banned the traffic in human body parts, for example, or even designating someone as a witch, and sniffing out witches and things like that. And that act has never been repealed under this government. Can you? I mean, I think that should be broadcast far and wide all over the world.
Yes.
Probably the worst and the most anti-black, most racist law ever passed in South Africa, from their point of view, that all cultures are equal, is the Suppression of Witchcraft Act of 1957, and it's still on the statute book, and it's still being applied today. And I think that was necessary, to protect people from these practices. I
was just reading that in KwaZulu-Natal, they they were eating people because the witch doctor told them to.
Yes, that takes place every now and again, and yes, body parts are consumed in all sorts of concoctions, which they call medicine. You know, and I won't go into all the gory details.
Yeah.
It exists, and it's part of this culture of witchcraft and so on. So Christianity was a very positive force in that.
Yes.
At least I wouldn't say it completely eliminated it, but at least it brought in another belief system that gave people something to adhere to and as
have morals and values.
Exactly. And you know, and you meet quite and our churches, especially the Afrikaner Protestant churches, the three our three they call them the sister churches, the Dutch Reformed Church, the Reformed Church, and there's another one, also a Reformed Church, but it's got another name in Afrikaans because we've got two words for reform. The one is hervormde. It also exists in Dutch. And those three churches had, during the 20th century, they had a huge effort to, to Christianize the whole of Southern Africa. They sent out missionaries to all the other African countries in our area. And therefore, as a result of all of our efforts, 70% of Southern Africa is Christian.
Yeah.
And if it hadn't been for that, I think the West would now have been, for example, if Southern Africa had been Islamicized instead of Christianized, the West would now have been on its way out. I mean, it would have been, they would have had a far bigger problem with Islam than they already have, thanks to us. But instead of kind of commending us for that, giving us a pat on the shoulder, we've just been vilified and ostracized, and insulted all these years. Whereas, we really did our bit for promoting Western civilization and civilized values, as opposed to all this dark stuff, this the primitive, the trafficking in human body parts and irrational beliefs, sniffing out witches, killing people because they are suspected of being witches, and that sort of thing. And our authors have written here and there about these sorts of issues in a very academic sort of way, and also some of our literary authors have also written about that.
Well, my dad told me, fighting in Angola, before they would go out, they would all, pray in Afrikaans. That it's, it was a complete Christian nation. My dad grew up in Pakirasras. And, you had to go to church every Sunday. Or I think actually more than every Sunday. He said that you had to go
almost twice
times
on every Sunday.
Twice on every Sunday.
Yes. And despite being a very Christian country, I think we still had freedom of religion in South Africa. I mean, we've had a small, but now it's of course growing, a Muslim community here that has also been a fairly moderate Muslim community, except perhaps recently things are changing now. But we managed to, also accommodate other religions here. For example, the Jewish religion. I read not so long ago in the local Jewish newspaper that South Africa is one of the countries on the list which is almost completely free of anti-Semitism. So we were very tolerant towards Islam and the Jewish religion.
You know what I was surprised to hear about?
Hindus. Yeah, in fact, there's a whole Indian community here that was brought, by the British colonial administration to Natal.
Yeah.
And 80% of them are Hindus and 20% are Muslim. In fact, that's, yeah.
I was surprised to hear that you guys have such a huge Scientology movement there.
I'm not so aware of that.
I don't know if it still exists, but I know that Ron L. Hubbard did build a huge Scientology center there.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it's possible. I recently went to Amsterdam, and then I was walking around there with a friend, and he showed the Scientology center in Amsterdam to me, and that's really big.
So yeah, they're always huge.
It's a lot bigger than over here, I would say. But
yeah,
I mean, you could be right. I just haven't
maybe that's
followed
from the olden days.
Yeah. I know it exists, but I haven't met anyone who is a member of Scientology. Or
you would know.
I wouldn't know. Exactly.
Yes.
So South Africa really, it was part of the Western system, and including Christianity, and we did a lot to Christianize and to Westernize Southern Africa, and that made a real contribution to Western culture, but also to the strategic position of the Western world globally. And for that, we were punished.
I know.
We were not rewarded in any way. We were punished for that, and we were called all sorts of names. I when the whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission thing happened, which was all just a big propaganda exercise. But I was crazy enough to buy the entire set of, I don't know how many, 10 volumes of books in which the report was published. And, in there they enumerate all of the so-called human rights abuses of the old South African government. And I was quite surprised to read in it that all in all, the South African government and its representatives, the security forces, over a period of 40-odd years, killed 540 people. Where there was some, now in a lot of those incidents, it might have been self-defense on the part of a policeman, or a group of policemen were stormed by a mob and they had to open fire. All of those stats are included in there. But I'm telling you now that if you look at most countries in the world over a period of 40 years, probably you could say that more than 500 people died as a result of some form of police action during that period.
Absolutely.
So in the global picture, it is completely negligible. If you look at the race riots in the USA, for example, in Detroit and places like that, you had over a couple of days more than 100 people being black people being killed by the police in America. So, and America wasn't seen as a country that had committed a crime against humanity. Whereas, this is always said about South Africa, that we had committed a crime against humanity. But to those people, I then ask, show me where the mass graves are. I mean,
not only
Nana
that,
Maasbro-
people, I feel like people in this country, they know nothing about South Africa. They praise Nelson Mandela. You know, growing up, when people found out that my dad's from South Africa, I'm automatically a racist. You know, we're demonized no matter what. I mean, even in the movies, South Africans are always played as this racist, horrible character. And
Yes.
that all they know is apartheid. They don't know the details behind it, and they don't care. It's just that we're the evil white man that, you know, that were horrible to blacks.
Yes, you're right. But of course, that was also something that didn't come about by accident. I think it was planned.
Yeah, me too.
I think there were radical groups within South Africa. I mean, a small group of people, but very radical, communist and anti-South African. I mean, the communist leader, whose name was Joe Slovo, he wasn't even born.
I know.
He was born
Wasn't he
in
like?
Lithuania.
Yes.
He only came here at the age of 10. And he then became a powerful leader because he was in cahoots with the ex-Soviet Union and some of the East European communist states. And when our unfortunate leader, Mr. de Klerk, finally just capitulated to the Communist Party and the ANC, I mean, he was one of the main negotiators for the ANC.
I mean, when it comes to de Klerk, did he really think that he was going to win against Mandela, or did he just sell South Africa out completely?
I think it was a bit of both. I think he was megalomaniac enough to think he was going to win the election against Nelson Mandela. I mean, I've heard from various sources, including people who were close to his ex-wife, who also got murdered under very mysterious circumstances later.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. I mean, he got divorced from her because he had an affair with this Greek woman. And then she was just murdered a year or two later, supposedly by a common law criminal who just wanted to take, rob her of a TV set or something. But I think
suspicious.
It was all very suspicious. And during the trial, there were all sorts of elements that were never looked at, and there was,
Does he still live in the country?
Yes, apparently he does. He lives in a mansion down in the Cape, on the coast, looking out over the ocean. Apparently he's a millionaire now. None of our other leaders from the past, I mean, all of the African leaders, they spend their lives in politics where they supposedly earn a salary of, say, $100,000 per year, but when they retire, they are absolute millionaires or billionaires even. Now, our leaders in the past, I mean, first of all, they had very modest salaries by international standards, and when they retired, they weren't rich at all. So, which showed you that we were not corrupt at the time.
Right.
I mean, somebody like P.W. Botha, when he, I mean, I actually went to see him twice in his coastal home in George, or near George at the time, and he paid that house with a bank loan, with a mortgage loan that he got from a bank. He didn't die a wealthy man. He only owned his own home, and that was it. Whereas now, I mean, Mr. Zuma, his son, is a billionaire, and he's involved in all sorts of dubious dealings with the so-called Gupta family, a family of Indians who came to South Africa, and they front page news all the time, and even the liberal press, even our liberal media and so on, are saying that the Guptas and this government are corrupt.
Yeah.
And even the liberal journalists are even writing books about it, and pointing out all the various corrupt deals that have taken place.
I think I saw something. I don't know if he's liberal or not, but some author that just wrote about the corruption within the government, and there was like a big ordeal about it.
Yes, there have been a couple of books about that, but they mostly, most of the mainstream publishers in South Africa are liberal too, so
right.
They wouldn't publish a book by some conservative author.
South Africa. Sorry.
No. I know there's one. The most recent one was written by two journalists, two Afrikaans journalists, but it was written in English. Adrian Basson and Pieter de Tooy. And
that's who I'm thinking of.
Yeah, and both of them are completely over the top liberal, anti-white. And
how did that happen, though? I just don't understand. It being such a conservative country and
South Africa would make a very good study in the effects of propaganda. By means of propaganda, you can actually change people's minds and their worldview, and you can make them believe things that, you can turn their worlds upside down, and you can make them believe in lies and reject the truth and so on.
Do you think that the push of white guilt?
That plays a role too, yes. Although I would say the average white South African isn't really much prone to white guilt, but it's more a system of control as to what is acceptable to say and what isn't. So even though something to be the case, that, for example, I cited previously in our conversation the fact that only 500 people died as a result of some form of police or military action in 40 years in South Africa, regardless of the circumstances. So it's not a country where there was a genocide or something like that. And people know that more or less. But this notion that we or the whites in South Africa, and particularly the Afrikaners, they committed a crime against humanity. This phrase has been repeated so many times in South Africa that people know that in public you're not allowed to contradict that phrase. If you do that, then people are going to immediately attack you as being a racist and a fascist and a Nazi and so on. And so they are naturally scared of being, publicly shamed like that. And the journalists and, the people in the media, of course, they do this all the time.
Oh, yeah. They've written an article about me in South Africa, and I'm not even living there.
Well, yes, and we talked about sniffing out the witches before, which literally took place or still taking place in South Africa. Somebody it's illegal to do that, but it still happens every now and again that somebody would be sniffed out as a witch, and that person would then could be killed or could be ostracized from a certain community and so on. But the journalists are not that much different to the to the witch doctors, and we call them sangomas as well, who sniff out these witches. They're forever sniffing out these people who do not subscribe to the dominant ideology. And the dominant ideology is, of course, that the ANC and the Communist Party were these benign movements, even though they were committing urban terrorism and killing people, and even killing people in their own ranks, and even massacring other black people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, people don't know about necklacing here. They don't understand that they were killing their own people. Exactly.
So if you don't subscribe to that dominant ideology, then the mainstream media will make sure that you are you're stigmatized, or that you lose your job, you're named and shamed and so on. I mean, I have a concrete example in that there was a young woman who was a philosophy lecturer at the University of Pretoria. And then she said, well, she wanted to start writing a column on our website. And yes, and I said, we'd welcome that. And I think in the first or the second column, she said that when it comes to the rape of children in South Africa, there may be an element of African culture involved. She didn't say it was a certainty. She used the conditional.
Right.
It may, and that single phrase in a whole long article was enough to get her fired from her job at the University of Pretoria, and to such an extent that she had to leave the country.
Oh my God.
So, and that was thanks to another academic at another university and to the media that immediately started this kind of witch hunt against her. So, yeah, I mean, people under conditions like that, you've got, it's exactly the same as under communism. You had to be ideologically pure and you had to be a good communist. If you weren't a good communist, then you
pay the price.
You pay the price for that. And that's exactly how it works in South Africa. If you're a dissident and you don't agree with this absurd set of beliefs that they've imposed on us, then you pay the price, as you say. And it is a real price, because you won't get a job, or you'll lose your job. People won't do business with you. I mean, there have been all sorts of witch hunts against me over the years that I've sort of shrugged off and so on. I mean, eventually people also get tired of it, but you really have to be strong.
Yes.
And see to it that it doesn't weigh you down, because I mean, if you haven't got an independent source of income or something like that, I mean, they can destroy you from one day to the next. If you lose your job or you've got a little business and suddenly you don't have clients anymore, I mean, you'll end up in one of the white squatter camps, no problem. And our journalists, that's the work they do. They do the dirty work and the propaganda for the government.
Oh yeah, I mean they wrote an article about me, calling me an apartheid apologist, and that I'm a racist, and all of this stuff that I didn't even really say. But I thought it was funny. I was like, I live in America. I can say whatever the heck I want.
Yes, I mean, you've got the First Amendment, so
yes.
You're not, I mean, people here, I mean, we've got probably the highest murder rate in the world. Or if not the highest, I mean, in a place like Honduras, I think they've got a slightly higher murder rate, but in absolute numbers, far more people get killed in South Africa than in Honduras. I mean, India has got a population of over 1 billion, and I think we have more murder cases in South Africa than in India. So that gives you an idea.
Yeah, I mean, and they've stopped counting, so it's hard to keep track of how many murders are actually taking place.
Exactly.
And I was also reading
you
that
commit,
it's equally as dangerous as the Congo now, which is it's been having a civil war for how long now?
yes.
To think that South Africa has, I used to go every summer to visit my grandma, so I progressively got to watch it just go downhill.
Yes, exactly. And, our police are completely inefficient and corrupt. A lot of them are on the take. They've actually, the first thing they did was to fire most of the white officers in the police. And they replaced them with actually some of the terrorists. In fact, a lot of the so-called officers from their terrorist army were then appointed in high positions in the police force. And before, these people were involved in drug running and drug smuggling, gun running, and so on. And now suddenly it's like, they were all wolves in sheep's clothing. And from that moment onwards, shortly after 1994, our police force has just gone down. In fact, the head of the police at one point was, his name was Jackie Selebi. And because he was black, they actually voted him in as the head of Interpol. Can you believe that? The head of Interpol. And not too long afterwards, he had such obvious links to the underworld and to organized crime in South Africa that not only did he have to get fired, even though he had connections with the ruling party and so on, but he was also found guilty of corruption and all sorts of criminal charges, and he was sent to prison he was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and that was the head of our police force. But of course, due to his government connections, he only spent a few months in prison, and then he was out again. On medical grounds, supposedly.
Yeah.
There was somebody else who was also convicted of corruption, an Indian gentleman by the name of Shabir Sheikh. And he also was supposedly terminally ill while he was in prison, and then he was let out. But he's still
cured.
Alive. That was about 10 years ago, and he's still alive, and people see him on the golf course and so on, terminally ill, but playing golf.
Yeah.
So, if you know that people in the right places, getting
the corruption.
Prison sentence is not the end of the world.
Yes. I know.
But that gives you an idea of just how corrupt.
Yeah, I know. It's
if the
so
head of the
hard
police
to
could be
explain to
sent
people.
to prison for 15 years, and he had all these. He was openly friends with, some of the main criminal kingpins in South Africa, mafia, and so on.
So that's why people don't understand that instead of calling the police there, you guys have.
Yes, there are about 3 to 4 times more private security guards than there are policemen in South Africa. We've got 200,000 policemen, women, and we've got about 700,000 private security guards. So South Africa, in a sense, this country is also, it gives you a glimpse into the future of the world, because we are living, in conditions of extreme insecurity, and therefore society adapts in a certain way, and one of the ways is that everything is guarded and controlled, and of course in practice I think a lot of the identity checking and even databases and so on, that are kept on people in South Africa are probably against the Constitution and probably illegal against a lot of the laws concerning, privacy of information and that sort of stuff. But in practice, it just happens because that is the way it is being done. And in any one day, I mean, you have to go through some sort of a checkpoint and show your ID to a private security guard. It could be at the place where you live, or somebody you're visiting, or in all the office buildings everywhere. You have to sign in. You get scanned. You get even fingerprinted, and so on. And that's the way it works. And that is also the way we sort of keep afloat in the sea of crime that South Africa has become.
I don't know if you heard about the current case in San Francisco where an illegal Mexican shot a white woman, and they let him off. They didn't give him any time.
Yes, I read about that. Yes, it seems absolutely shocking.
And there was another case where a Somali cop shot a white woman in Minnesota and also didn't get any trouble. Like, nothing happened to him as well. Do you see that South Africa is kind of like a glimpse into the rest of, the West's future?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I was talking about, I was referring to the double standards before, and that was even a complaint by our foreign minister, say in the 1980s. His name was Pick Witter, and he was talking about the double standards in the world when it came to South Africa on a sort of a global political level. But within South Africa itself, there are now these double standards for black and white. I mean, to give you a simple example, I mean, in some of these murder, for example, I've got two examples for you. In the one case, there was a black man. We've got these so-called minibus taxis that are also a law unto themselves. I mean, I won't go into, don't get into
I know what they are.
They drive on the sidewalk. They drive on the wrong side of the road.
And they're packed to the bloody brim.
Exactly. Yeah, and they're not roadworthy. They're not insured. They do just what they like on the road. And one of these characters, he ran down a white girl on a motorcycle deliberately in the street. He drove after her and he ran her down and killed her. And he wasn't even charged. In fact, there was an outcry, and as a result of public pressure, he was eventually charged with murder. But some organization actually laid, not the police, but another organization laid the charge of murder against him. And he went to trial and he got some light sentence, maybe 5 years, 8 years prison, but he will only probably sit about 2 or 3 years because he was a black who'd killed a white woman, white girl. She was about 16 years old. And in another case, two farmers, in the east of Johannesburg, sort of 200 kilometers east from here.
It's like the Calgary,
they had a problem.
Or whatever.
Yeah, that was the so-called coffin case, where they had problems with theft and trespassing on their land. And then they caught one guy who was one black trespasser who was on his way to commit a crime. And in order to scare him off, they pulled a kind of a prank on him and put him in a coffin. They had an old coffin in their barn, and they put him in the coffin, and they threatened that they were going to put a snake in the
because they hate snakes.
Coffin with him, because Africans are dead scared of snakes.
I know.
Our snakes are pretty dangerous. Some of them.
I know, but they're so scared of that.
Yeah, but yeah. So, and they kind of scared him quite a bit, but eventually, but he was physically unharmed.
Right.
And he was then let go. They were charged with attempted murder, and they were given prison sentences of 14 years and 19 years respectively. So think about it. If you're a black taxi driver and you deliberately kill a white girl, you get maybe 5 years. If you put a black man in a coffin but you don't harm him, you just kind of, as a prank or as sort of an anti-crime measure or whatever, then you get 15 years, 14 years or 19 years prison. So to me, that incident in San Francisco, it smacks of these double standards that we've got in South Africa, that, the white victim, when there's a white victim, the sentence will be light.
Yeah.
If there's a white perpetrator, the sentence will be heavy. You'll see that coming to the fore more and more.
Yeah. And for me, that's kind of why I started this show, because I've seen what's happened in South Africa, and I've seen the beginning stages happening here, just like taking down our statues, blacks wanting reparations, like you said, if a white person is murdered, the perpetrator doesn't get in trouble. And it's scary. It's scary to think that this is now happening in our country, and also communism is being pushed in our country.
Yes, you're quite right. This whole, we all thought in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down that communism was dead. No, it didn't die there, and it's not dead. It has merely kind of adapted itself.
Yeah. It makes you think, who really won the Cold War? Exactly.
Yes. Yes. Because it's almost, I think Mr. Putin has said it once as well, that, it's as if the Western countries are emulating the old Soviet Union. More and more, you're finding exactly the same practices and attitudes and ideology that you had in the old Soviet Union in the Western countries, both in Western Europe and in North America. This man in Canada, Justin Trudeau, he just seems extreme.
There's a rumor that
he would have
been
a model communist in the old Soviet Union.
Absolutely. I was also, just to bring it back, that if you are a farmer and you're under attack and you shoot your attacker, is it true that you get in trouble?
Well, theoretically, the right to self-defense still exists, but, you're probably going to have to prove to the court that your life was in danger.
Okay.
And only then would you be allowed to shoot in self-defense. So either you would have to be attacked with another firearm or a knife or something like that for you to be able to shoot in self-defense. But in practice, I think if people are prepared enough, they can still defend themselves. I've got a friend who's got a business where he's got robbed once, but he carries a firearm with him all the time, and he's got all sorts of guns on his premises, and he takes the line that even if he has to go to court afterwards, he will shoot to kill.
Good.
And even if he has to go to court afterwards, he'll fight the case for years, and he's got enough money for that to afford the lawyers and so on. But I think I know of someone else who, they got held up in their home by some black robbers who were threatening to kill them. But fortunately, the teenage son of about 15, he was not in the kitchen when these guys came to hold them up. And then he fetched his dad's pistol, and then he shot one of the attackers, and he shot him dead.
Yes.
And then he was charged with murder.
Oh no.
And he had to, and it took about 5 years, but he was eventually acquitted. So, yeah, I think it's still possible to defend yourself, put it that way.
It's funny. I met somebody that lives in Johannesburg a couple weeks ago, and I told her that, that I am a South African activist in the States trying to raise awareness of what's happening there. And she completely denied the farm murders and what's happening, and looked at me like I was crazy.
Wow. Well, that's quite extreme, because even some of the liberal journalists they're practically communists and anti-white, everything. Even they acknowledge that there's a problem with these farm murders. They might differ as to what's causing it.
Right.
They would say that it's the kind of it's the effects, the lingering effects of white racism that is making these black attackers so violent. But they will still acknowledge the fact that it's happening.
Right.
And these are.
Well, she also lived in Sandton, and I think she lives in a bubble, perhaps.
Yes, probably. Yeah, you've got these people who, you can. I think a lot of white people in South Africa are living in a bubble.
Yeah. Because
they don't listen to the state-owned radio. They don't watch the state-owned TV. So they don't see much of the propaganda or hear it. And they've got some paid TV station where they sort of watching Hollywood movies and
yeah, we have the same problem here in America. It's easier for them to live in a bubble.
Exactly, and they live in a gated community.
Yes.
And they work in a big office building where they've also got private security. So, there was a Swedish journalist who wrote a book about South Africa a few months ago, and she said in her book that life in Johannesburg mainly takes place indoors.
Yes.
You travel from one gated community to the next. So, and I think she was expressing something of that bubble there, that you can actually live in these walled communities, and you go to a shopping center that's crawling with private security guards and cameras and so on. And you can never be exposed to the reality of what's going on around you.
Right.
And you can actually deny it, as this person was doing towards you.
Yeah.
And I think at a certain level, and that's part of our problem, I think it's part of human nature to deny the the negative aspects of your reality. One of the best examples I've got of that is, I read in some German book somewhere that at the end of the Second World War, when the German army was collapsing, and and the Red Army was on its way to Berlin, a lot of the women and the civilians knew about 6 weeks in advance that the Red Army was coming.
Right.
But they would only start running once they heard the sounds of the tanks in the streets, by which time it was too late, and a lot of them got raped and killed and so on. About 2 million Germans died during that period, because it was in the winter. and there are horrific stories. I mean, it's part of the. I mean, recently a few books have been published in Germany about that because before it was taboo. It was a completely taboo topic.
Right.
But yes, I mean, imagine that you're knowing 6 weeks in advance of something really bad that's going to happen, but you wait until it's actually starting to happen before you react. And that's exactly what you've got here in South Africa too. A lot of people are just denying that it's going on, and
Right.
or it won't. I've read it in the newspaper, but it won't happen to me. That sort of mentality, you find that a lot, and probably in the US and in Europe and so on, you'll have the same syndrome happening over and over again because as things get worse and the demographics change, people will move away or they'll live in gated communities
Well, I also think that whites have become so complacent, and it's almost like they're asleep. Like it's easier for them not to know what's going on. Yes. Because it's a burden knowing what's going on in the world.
Exactly. Yeah, because then you've got to make a choice. You've got to actually say to yourself, okay, I've got to start doing something, or I've got to join up with some militia group or some neighborhood watch or a farm watch. I've got to go on patrols. I've got to arm myself. I've got to, keep some emergency supplies. I mean, regarding the water in South Africa, I think you have to keep a supply of water on your premises because sooner or later you might find that there's no water, and then
that's just unbelievable.
If you want to make a cup of coffee, you'll have to get it somewhere. It confronts you with a choice. And people don't want that. They don't want to make that choice. And they can create this whole make-believe world for themselves.
Yeah.
Where they never have to make the choice. They just have to, they're just free to go on with their daily life, centering around the shopping center and going to work, making ends meet and so on. I think there's a whole philosophical discussion about that that one should have, and people should write books about that or novels about that, of people being confronted with those aspects of reality and how they're going to deal with that. And there have been some interesting books written in South Africa too, in all sorts of ways, and I'm hoping that as people in the outside world become more aware of the situation here, that that they will start interacting with us and also reading some of the stuff that's been written here, and maybe we can even make movies about that, TV programs, documentaries, and so on. So there's a whole lot of things to do around this whole issue.
Yeah, I think a great awakening needs to take place because it's just getting worse and worse. And in every place that whites are, they are trying to, at the end of the day, they want us extinct.
Yes, I lived in France quite a while ago for about 6 or 7 years, so I've been following the situation there on and off.
Yeah.
And demographically, France is also changing quite fast. And there are whole areas of the country and some of the cities apparently that are now no-go zones and Islamicized and where there's almost Sharia law and so on. And I remember in the days when I lived in Paris, it was perfectly safe. You could, the metro would stop at around 1 o'clock in the morning, and then, if you'd gone to a friend's apartment for dinner. You could walk home through the empty streets, and even a woman alone could do that.
Right.
Whereas apparently now, France and Paris, it's also become dangerous. So you have the same conditions that we've got here that are making themselves felt all over the Western world.
Mm-hmm. Italy as well. I mean,
yes.
Europe.
Yeah, and Sweden. I mean, Sweden.
Oh, Sweden is
kind of Scandinavian socialist paradise.
Yeah.
And now they've also got rape and murder and terrorism and so on. So it's I say that the whole world in the next decade or two will start looking like South Africa.
Yes.
Because we're in the minority now, and generally speaking, Europeans in the world are in a minority. So as the population starts this process of population movement going on, and once that reaches a certain level, yes, that demographic reality will translate into other realities such as crime and insecurity and injustice, double standards when it comes to the court systems. Unless, of course, there's, as you say, some kind of awakening and people actively start to oppose the inevitability of that process.
Yeah. I mean, I always say that South Africa, in a sense, was the first multiculturalism experiment.
Yes.
And it should be an example that multiculturalism does not work.
Yes, exactly. And I tend to think that, yes, there literally was, a small group of very powerful people who got around, in a smoke-filled room somewhere and decided that, let's try this out in South Africa and see what happens. We are guinea pigs in this experiment. And
absolutely.
And we're being measured and controlled and we're not allowed to opt out of it. I mean, you're just caught up in this thing, and the only way of getting out of it is literally to emigrate from the country. And even then,
it's so challenging.
Exactly. It's very challenging, but you're also just postponing the inevitable, because ultimately those conditions will also catch up with your new place of residence, whether it's in Europe or Australia or, I mean, a friend of mine immigrated to Australia. He reckons that he gives Australia another 15 years.
Oh, yeah. Australia is horrible.
It's like South Africa.
Oh, it's such a liberal government also.
Exactly.
I don't think people also understand that, the Afrikaners have been in South Africa for 400 years.
Exactly. We've been here as long as Americans have been in America.
Yes. So
and
it's...
for the bigger part of that history, we were perhaps not the overall majority in the country, but we were a significant population as a percentage of the total population, and then that was why we could control large areas of the country. And apart from your traditional tribal black areas, it's our country, and we developed it and we organized it and we built the roads and the dams and the water systems and power stations and so on. And then suddenly, almost overnight, we found ourselves in a situation where we are now a powerless minority. And we're looking at these people who've
for
just taken
being
over.
there for 400 years, you would think that they would have progressed as people, and it's just proven that they'll remain tribalistic and barbaric no matter what. You can't.
Yeah, that's a whole topic of discussion in itself, because on the one hand, you've got, I would probably call it a pseudo-Westernism or a pseudo-Western consumption lifestyle that's very evident here. For example, we spoke about the shopping centers earlier on, and on the streets, you see all of these black people driving very expensive cars and dressing in very expensive clothes, and they've got this Hollywood lifestyle, and it's mostly the elite that are connected with either government, municipalities that are completely corrupt and so on.
Right.
But they've channeled a lot of the wealth of the country to themselves and to their own consumption. That's very evident as soon as you step off the plane in South Africa. I spoke to somebody from Mexico the other day, and he told me, there are some rich people in Mexico, but I've never been in a place like this where you see so many expensive cars on the road. Yeah. I mean, apart from, I think, Geneva in Switzerland is apparently also a very wealthy city, and you can literally see a Ferrari just about on every city block. But apart from Geneva, I think Johannesburg must be the place where you would see the most kind of expensive cars and
I live in Los Angeles, and even going to Johannesburg, I'm like, what the heck?
Yes. I mean, it's Lamborghinis, Rolls Royce, Mercedes, and not just the sort of entry level model, the most expensive one with the biggest engine and the most.
And the rims.
The rims and everything.
Yes.
If the price is not in the millions of the rands or the hundreds of thousands of dollars, then they won't even look at being seen in it.
Right.
So there's that aspect, that sort of superficial westernization, which is expressing itself in the form of conspicuous consumption. But at another level, the Western and probably also Christian value system that has not really been adopted, and you find that values such as honesty, integrity, modesty as well, those don't come into it at all. I'm struck every time I go to Northern Europe, to maybe Scandinavia, Netherlands, Germany, and so on, that there's a sort of a modesty about the people that, and even when people are wealthy and so on, they don't flaunt their wealth, and I've also read somewhere that in the Netherlands and in the US as well. I mean, the two countries in the world where people donate the most money to charity are the US and the Netherlands. So, you've got people who want to do good. They want to donate to good causes, help other people, and so on. Whereas what we are experiencing here is exactly the opposite. I mean, this guy in his Porsche is shopping at the brand name boutique in Sandton. He's not going to donate a cent to charity. He doesn't care what happens to the poor or the downtrodden or the disabled.
They don't care what's happening to their own people.
Exactly. He's only in it for himself.
Right.
And he wants to. He doesn't care about the day of tomorrow. He's in it for the moment.
It's a decadent lifestyle.
Exactly. I mean, they even on the radio they have these ads saying, live in the moment, and that sums it up. They are living in the moment.
Right.
And while there's money now, and they can loot the state's coffers for the next year, what comes afterwards? We're already downgraded to junk status.
I know.
As a country, and our deteriorating debt situation, but they don't care about that. because for now they're okay, and they can still keep going and have the party and have the feast. In the African culture, there's also this element of when the times are good, you must have a party and you feast as if there's no tomorrow.
I'm well aware of when they get paid on Friday nights.
Yes.
You can hear them all. You can hear them all to the break of dawn.
Yeah. You go to the bar and you spend your entire week's wages in one night. That sort of mentality.
Yes. I was going to ask you about something that you mentioned at American Renaissance about South Africa being the canary in the coal mine.
Yes.
And how he's flopping around in his cage, coughing and wheezing. How do we get people to stop digging and look?
Yes, I think we, to some extent, we've already made a breakthrough through social media internationally.
Yes.
And because it gets into social media and Twitter and Facebook and so on, it would also eventually end up in the mainstream media. Whereas for a long time, I think for about 20 years, or close to 20 years, people in the rest of the world have ignored what was happening here. And they've refused to see it. Whereas now, a lot of the kind of people on the right and the celebrity people in social media, maybe like Ann Coulter in the States, Katie Hopkins in the UK, those sorts of people have started to tweet about South Africa and about the farm murders and about conditions here. And I think even Trump, before he became president, he once mentioned it as well.
Yeah.
So I think, coming from where we were, where there was complete silence about conditions here, we've already made a lot of progress. So we've come a long way, and we have achieved some kind of a breakthrough now.
Yes.
But we must now go further, and we must now push. I mean, the door is slightly open. And we must now push it wide open and really make
Americans in general. I mean, growing up, when I would tell people my dad's from South Africa, they would think my dad was black. So, I mean, there's a level of awareness that's happening now because people, honestly, they didn't even realize there were whites in South Africa.
Oh, yes.
And since I've just started this show, and I'm getting so many messages from people around the country saying, like, I had no idea what's happening in South Africa. Yes. And how can I help?
Yes.
So there's definitely an interest in helping. But it's,
but I think in order to succeed, we're going to have to think creatively, in a sense.
Yes.
And it's also, it has to be a major movement, because otherwise we're not going to have much impact. If it's only going to be a report here and there, and then the next day people forget about it, we're not really going to be able to change the situation.
Right.
So we have to look at the methods used by the communists and by the left. And I mean, having studied at a more or less communist university, I was kind of trained in this kind of stuff. I read Karl Marx and Lenin and all the theorists about culture, and Bertolt Brecht and so on. I mean, Bertolt Brecht's theater in East Germany was all about promoting the communist ideal. So art and literature and all that, movies, all of that has to be used to put forward this message. And I think we could learn from that and use other media and film and creative writing and so on to exactly put across our message. And
Yeah.
I even know one person here who wants to start up some form of a serial. He'll write a fictional tale about an American visiting South Africa, and just on a hunting trip, and then things would happen to him here that inevitably makes him implicated in what's going on here, and then he has to start playing a role here. And I think something like that could be very interesting.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's also entertainment. I mean, you could read it for just to be entertained.
And it's relatable too.
And it will be available to online and so on.
Right. And I think Americans can relate to it better because, when you do try to talk about South Africa and the atrocities that are happening there and how brutal they are, it's hard for them to grasp because it's, they don't understand how violent it is. And you're dealing with, with tribalistic people.
Yes. Yes. And I was referring to one of our, some of our authors and so on. I mean, there's one author, and one of our columnists has just written about her, saying that she's also one of these kind of liberal people and denying reality and so on. I think she became like that later on. And she's very old now. She's probably over 90 years old now. But she wrote a thing in 1960, which dealt, I think that the title of the novel was Waiting for the Chief. And it was all about the clash of civilizations between, say, Christianity and Africa, African tribalism, witchcraft, and so on. And it's about, I won't go into all the detail now, but it's about a Portuguese woman who marries somebody in Angola. And then she comes to Angola, and she has to start a new life there. And then she gets confronted with all of these realities. And it's, that's a completely forgotten novel now from early 1960s. But I've even thought of maybe getting permission from the publisher to translate the thing into English and maybe into a few European languages. And that could also be the start for people to discover what was really going on and what is still really going on in South Africa, and the incompatibility of these value systems. But it also talks, that novel, because it was written in the early 1960s, before political correctness became so pervasive and almost universal all over the world. Even though she probably was never really conservative, but at the time she just, spoke about things as they are. And it also touches on the issue of race as well, because when the main character, comes to Angola, she discovers that her new husband, as happened in the Portuguese colonies, had a black concubine, and he had some mulatto mixed race children with this woman as well. And then eventually, as things play out, there's a whole, there's a cultural aspect, but there's also a racial aspect to it. And it's very honest, and she's very honest about it, and it's very real as well. And you have the sense that she knew a lot about what she was writing about there. She'd obviously visited the Portuguese colonies at the time that were still being ruled by Portugal, Angola, and Mozambique. And she understood what was happening there, and she experienced a lot of what was going on. So, and that will give people some insights, I think, into this whole problem.
There's a book.
And in a sense, we can approach this thing in two ways. Either we can just be very, very pessimistic and think about all the doomsday scenarios, and there are a lot of them.
There are,
but on the other hand, it's also a kind of a challenge to us, and it's something that if we are going to surmount it, we're going to have to respond creatively to the situation.
Right.
And I think that, there's this sense of, the West has been, throughout its history, has been characterized by this Promethean ability to not only survive but to surmount a crisis by reinventing itself and
rising from the ashes
and so on. And I think that can happen again. But we'll have to work on it, and we'll have to have that vision.
Yeah.
And be inspired, and then we would be able to do it.
Yeah.
And the one thing that gives me some optimism is that, South Africa, unlike a lot of other places in the world, I think America got a lot of, in the initial stages, a lot of capital from Europe and probably from Britain as well, and a lot of immigrants too, European immigrants who went there, and that way it was able to develop. But in a way, we had to pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We literally had nothing. We didn't have the population. We didn't have the money. Nothing. We just had to.
No, South Africans are like the toughest
we were real
people
pioneers.
I've ever met. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and literally, you can. I've still got relatives like that. You can put these people without anything into some remote corner of the bush, and within a couple of months, they will have created, some semblance of civilization there. Then there will be a system, and they'll have food to eat, and there will be stuff being grown in the fields. So yes, we've got that ability to create something out of nothing. So, and also if you look at our culture and our literature and music and so on, there's a whole there's a very powerful popular music scene in Afrikaans at the moment, and people are going to concerts and festivals. Even at this very moment, there's a thing. There's a whole series of concerts called Afrikaans is Groot. Afrikaans is great, and thousands of people go and listen to the singers there. And it's, they've got one token black singer now, but it's mostly white singers and attended by white people and so on. So there's a very strong popular culture there, and we've got a lot of poetry and
South Africans
over the years, and it's a whole body, it's a whole tradition and a body of work there that we can draw from now. I once spoke to an Italian philosopher, and he said, tradition is like a kit bag on your back, and you can take out of it what you need. And we have a whole bag there. A bag of goodies that we've created in the past, and that our ancestors have created, and our fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and so on. And we can take out of it what we need in order to confront the situation we're finding ourselves in at the moment.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize how educated South Africans are. It's, the first heart transplant took place in South Africa. You guys were so advanced in so many ways.
Yes, exactly. We had created this plant that manufactured gasoline from coal. And there's even a second one now, which is far bigger, and it's branched off into all sorts of other chemicals, and they actually creating gasoline out of gas now, out of natural gas and polymers and all sorts of stuff. And all of that was just done locally. And I mean, obviously, some of the technology and the know-how also came from Europe and maybe from Germany and so on. But we used all of that to create an economy here and science and we can still do it. I mean, we needn't be so pessimistic about the current situation. And it's also obvious, with all the internecine struggles within the ruling party and the division, they are typically like a band of robbers. I mean, I compare them to, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves,
Yes.
I mean, our country was just the cave of Alibaba that they could go and loot.
Yes.
But now they are struggling amongst themselves because the loot's they're getting to the bottom of the barrel now. And they're literally killing themselves to get to it. I mean, they in order to get a position within the ruling party now, there's so much competition for that there are political killings, especially among the Zulus in Natal. So, while all of this is going on, I think we just need to have our own plan and our own vision of how we go forward. And in conjunction with people elsewhere in the Western world, in Europe and in the US, I think we can work together because our problem is not, I mean, it's a global problem now.
It is.
I mean, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it was just our problem, but it's obvious to me now with everything that's going on in the States and Europe that it's a global problem and it's a civilizational problem. And we've got to confront it together. I mean, we've each got our local issues and situations, but broadly speaking, I mean, we're in this together. We're all in the same boat.
We're all brothers and sisters at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I guess strong. I mean, on my visit to Europe 2-3 weeks ago, I mean, I strongly got that impression in Germany, Netherlands, Belgium. I mean, people are all talking about the same kind of thing. And they're also very interested in our experience here. And also the possibilities for cooperation between us. So in a way, it's also an exciting time now that we're going through.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day,
before, I mean, we had these. I mean, people referred to the First and the Second World War as essentially Western civil wars. I mean, we annihilated each other on an industrial scale. For what? I mean,
they were brother wars.
Exactly. I mean, for the Zuma dynasty or whatever to ultimately control the world, or for Europe to become a caliphate, or I mean, for southern US to become part of Mexico or something, that just doesn't make sense at all. I mean, the US and Britain were fighting Germany, and now they're driving German cars, So
we tend to fight on the wrong side.
I mean, why would you kill people that in other ways you have respect and admiration for? I mean, why would you want to do that? It just doesn't make sense. So at least with this new problem that we've got, it kind of limits the possibilities of further civil wars and internecine wars among Western peoples. Even with Russia, because, even though Russia, for most of the 20th century, it was ideologically separate from the rest of European culture.
Right.
I think now to a large extent. We've gone back to the 19th century in that Russia is now part of. Russia is just another European country.
Yeah.
And Europeans see it that way too.
Yeah.
So we must guard against, having a new Cold War, and again for, the European peoples to be divided among themselves while they are being threatened demographically and ideologically by a lot of the, by Africa and the Middle East, and even by China. Even though China might not be such a sinister country at the moment, in the long run, I think China is a competitor. Both China and India are competitors to the Western nations, and we have to deal with them and see them in that way, because ultimately, if the whole world had to become Chinese, it's not going to be very pleasant either.
No.
Even though Chinese might be more efficient and might be in other respects more civilized than Africans, but still, they don't have our values. They don't subscribe to our values. They don't have the same respect for animals.
No, that's...
And so on.
Yeah.
Many things one can enumerate.
Yeah, if the Chinese did ever take over South Africa, the Africans would be begging for the whites to come back because they're pretty ruthless.
True.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, and thanks for inviting me. And then, I suppose there will be a podcast of this as well.
Oh yeah, we're on iTunes. We're on Google. We have a YouTube channel.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'll also do my best to, publicize this.
Absolutely. Do you have any websites or anything you'd like to promote before?
Yeah, people can go and visit praag.org. That's praag.org. And they can also follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is just my name. It's Dan Roodt, Roodt at the end. And I'm also on Facebook.
Awesome. So, I love your tweets, by the way. They're hysterical.
Oh, thanks, Dan.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dan, for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Okay, it's my pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Goodbye.
We announced that our membership figures stood at 769,800. Listen properly. 769,820 members, down from 100.2 million in 2012.